Now we're going to move on to 2.03, state budget update. Is this Dr. Noonan?
Turn it over to Ms. Michael.
Thank you so much for the opportunity this evening to talk about the final state budget. So the General Assembly did convene on May 13th, and they did adopt a budget for FY24 and FY25. And then Governor Youngkin approved both of those budget bills, so they were enacted. So first, when we look at FY24, which is the current fiscal year that actually ends at the end of this week, there were budget amendments, but they were technical in nature, so we're not expecting them to have a significant financial impact. We're waiting for VDOE to give us that final information. So the final state budget impacts will be included in the final budget review that comes to the school board in September. But we have no concerns about that in terms of the overall impact. When we look at the changes for FY25, these are the changes that I'm going to talk about now that are really starting from what happened between the original General Assembly bill and what finally happened. So the General Assembly initially wanted to expand the sales tax base. That was part of their proposal. And when the budget was finally adopted, that sales tax base expansion was removed. So they wanted to include additional things in sales tax, like streaming, for example. And in the final budget, none of that was included. There's a relationship between sales tax and basic aid. So when sales tax goes up, basic aid goes down. And when sales tax goes down, basic aid goes up. It's called a basic aid offset. So because they removed that expansion of sales tax from the base, that meant that basic aid then needed to go up some because of that loss in sales tax. But even when you combine the net impact of both of those, it was still a reduction as compared to what was in the General Assembly budget. They also made changes to the infrastructure and operations per pupil, and they increased some funding for that. One of the things that they did, and I was very grateful it didn't impact us, was they changed the deadline for when school divisions had to spend their HVAC funding. So we had gotten some ARPA grants for improving ventilation that we used at Maryland Henderson. So surprisingly, when they adopted the budget in May, they actually moved the deadline for spending that funding up from December 31st to July 31st, which was difficult for many school divisions, but thankfully our funding was fully expended, so no impact there. And then they did make a few other adjustments listed on the slide that don't impact us directly, including reducing funding to the laboratory schools and reducing some funding for Virginia Preschool Initiative based on historical non-participation rates. So when we look at what are the impacts from the final state budget to FCCPS and to the budget adopted by the school board in May, the first is for our standards of quality funding, there was a decrease of just about $173,000. And that resulted from a decrease both in basic aid and sales tax. There was an increase in funding of incentive funding of $686,296. That was due to a compensation increase. The original budget that was proposed only had a bonus for staff, and the final budget had a recurring increase for staff. So that provided us with additional compensation funding of $151,393. And then there was also some funding because they were able to restore the supplemental funding in lieu of the grocery and food tax. So both of those combined got us to the $686,000 increase in that category. And then the last category of lottery funding also had an increase. It was due to an increase in funding for at-risk, as well as an increase in that operations and infrastructure per pupil funding. So this chart kind of walks through what all of those fiscal impacts were from the final state budget as compared to the school board's budget in May. So as we talked about, the SOQ funding decreased, but that was more than offset by those changes in incentive, which was primarily compensation, and that grocery tax hold harmless funding. So overall, the net impact to FCCPS is additional funding of $545,377. So that's really good news in terms of the state.
Before we go,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
clarifying question about this. It's
Sure.
probably a terminology thing, one of those things
Yeah.
I don't understand about the
Sure.
state language of budgets. When I look at this with my layman's hat, I'm like, oh, incentive accounts, categorical accounts, this feels like restricted funding. Can you talk a little bit about, just clarify that for me, please?
Yes, absolutely, I can. When the state provides funding to school divisions, it's divided in certain funding categories. SOQ is all tied to the standards of quality. When they say incentive accounts, there are requirements. So in order to get that funding, you must meet whatever the requirement is. So in order for us to receive the compensation supplement funding that we just went over, we had to meet their minimum salary increase in order to qualify for that. And the state for incentive funding in recent years has not always had an all or nothing. They often have a category where if you meet a minimum, you can qualify for partial funding. But you're absolutely right, it is restricted and has a required match. They also have categorical accounts, which are based on certain categories of students. And then the last is lottery-funded programs. Over time, when the lottery was first introduced, lottery funding was really extra or supplemental to school divisions. And what the state has done over time is they've moved many items that we would all think of as basic funding into the lottery-funded account. So for me, a perfect example of that is textbook funding. You would never think that textbook funding is from lottery, but that's one of the items in those lottery-funded accounts. So they're just giving the revenue source in that category.
So thank you, that's helpful. Does this mean that, does the state require us to account one for one back? I mean, I know cash is fungible, but does this mean that I'm not sure this is not actually accurate, so just example. If the state says, all right, you're getting, $200,000 extra for textbooks, that we then have to show the state we spent an extra $200,000 on textbooks, or at least $200,000 on textbooks, or how does that work?
So in each of the categories, when you look at funding, we do have what's required, or what's called a required local match. So it's not always dollar for dollar. We're very fortunate in that Falls Church City far exceeds the required local effort for all of the categories. And actually all the schools in Virginia are exceeding that amount. So really the only place where we generally have to be very careful about ensuring that we're going to be able to meet the requirements are in those incentive accounts, right? That's where we have to pay particularly close attention. And what the state does when they send this budget out is they also send for us a document where we have to sign off that we're meeting the obligations for any funding that has specific requirements. Thank you. Of course. So the recommendation in terms of this additional funding is when the school board approved the budget in May, we had two positions that we had moved from recurring funding to one-time. It was the secondary counselor position and the elementary math resource teacher. I mean, we would like to move those positions back to recurring funding using this money. So that would be the first recommendation. And then the second would be to defer action on that remaining funding available, which would be $336,517. If we defer funding now, we could wait and see where our enrollment is in the fall. Because if we need any additional teachers or positions to cover increased enrollment that could be beyond what we projected, this funding could help us ensure that we can maintain class size by hiring additional positions if needed.
Thank you.
The last slide. We did keep Carlos Ortiz in there.
I don't think we need to let David know. So, no, thank you, Ms. Michael. That's it sounds like a better update for the state budget than when you talked to us a few months ago. So we appreciate that. Any questions about the update to the state budget or for Ms. Michael? Or yeah, Lori?
Are we needing to make a decision tonight about the deferred funding, or is that something that is going to be brought to us at a later date?
So this is a work session, so we're just presenting this recommendation, but no action needs to be taken this evening.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we would like to bring it for action in August.
Okay, great.
So if you can help refresh my recollection to the budget cycle that now it's passed and I've put it away. Were these two changes, the restoring, let me try that again. Was the restore recurring funding, the things that were moved to one time, were they moved to one time because of the other cascade of changes? This was stuff that we had originally wanted, then we moved out, then we moved back in.
Correct. These were items that were funded with recurring funding in the school board advertised budget. And when we adopted the final budget in May and there was lower revenue from the general government, we had moved these two positions from that recurring funding to the one-time bucket.
Okay. And so then is there an expectation that the state funding then will not decrease, such as will then allow us to sustain these?
We do expect the state funding to increase in future years. Generally, it does go up. There have been exceptions to that, but generally that is what happens.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions or comments from Ms. Michael? Great. Thank you, Ms. Michael. I appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. That concludes this 2.03 state budget update.